Hi everyone, my name is Jules and I'm going to be discussing the effects of BPA. I'm sure many of you have heard about BPA. It's a common topic of discussion. A few years ago it came out that it was really bad and in plastic, but a lot of people didn't quite understand why it was so bad and what they could do to get rid of it and avoid it, other than avoid plastic. So this is bisphenol A, otherwise known as BPA. So BPA is an organic synthetic compound that's found in polycarbonate plastics as well as epoxy resins. For those of you who have taken chemistry, this is the chemical structure of BPA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a few of the elements in here: hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. So BPA is found in a solid form at ambient temperatures. So in the air, in the ocean, it's going to be solid. It's got a low volatility. The water solubility is 120 to 300 milligrams per liter, and it's going to bind to solid or soils. So when it gets exposed into the ground, it's gonna actively bind. And most concerningly, there were 3 billion kilograms produced annually of BPA, so that's new BPA being created and being put into circulation for whatever purpose it's going to serve. So it's found in a variety of different places. Bottle caps, cans, lining of reusable bottles, Tupperware, canned foods, pacifiers, medical equipment, PVC piping, receipts, glass jars. A lot of that, it's in the lining of, and surprisingly, things like metal reusable water bottles, you think you're doing good because you're not getting the plastic, but it's in the lining. And bottle caps, they can say that a bottle is BPA free, but not specify that it's in the bottle cap. Or receipts. These are things that we have our hands on all the time without thinking about. You touch your mouth, you touch your face. Those have BPA on them. And PVC piping is one that we don't have a lot of contact with directly. However, it's how our sewage system runs. And the plumbing in our house is typically PVC piping, so it's everywhere. The reason it's used is, regardless, it's cheap. And it's the industry standard, and it's easy to develop, and it takes less time, and it's just easier. So it's continued to be used commonly. So there are 3 routes of exposure: ingestion, through the plasma membranes, and through inhalation. Inhalation is the least common route of exposure, and that would happen when you're near a landfill where there's a lot of BPA sitting around and you're going to inhale a little bit, but the effects aren't really notable for people that inhale substantial amounts because it's not very substantial. Through the plasma membranes, that's how you're going to come in contact with BPA: through receipts, through cleaning your Tupperwares, through cleaning or through touching PVC piping. But the most common route is ingestion. So when you eat something out of a Tupperware, when you drink out of that metal water bottle with the BPA lining, or something that was up against the bottle cap, that's how you're really going to get BPA into your system. So when you do ingest BPA, the liver is going to metabolize it, and it's going to create bisphenol A glucuronide, or BPA glucuronide. And a majority of this substance is going to be excreted out in urine. I'm sure many of you taken biology, and the liver does a lot of filtering out, so it is going to get most of it out of you. But of the little bit that's left in, it does react negatively with the body. It's a phenolic structure that remains, and it's going to act as either an antagonist or an agonist with the estrogen receptor. And so it's going to limit estrogen use, essentially. And it's going to affect pathogenesis of both genders. So some of the long-term consequences, the most notable one is infertility, specifically for women. It's also known to create hormone-dependent tumors, cause precocious puberty, several metabolic disorders, and endocrine disorders. And this is something worth noting because cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in the United States. It's the #1 cause of death. And two of the most common comorbidities with cardiovascular disease are obesity and diabetes. So this is something that many Americans are battling every day. And they might not realize that one of the reasons that they're so prone to obesity or diabetes is because they're ingesting large quantities of BPA, which could be affecting their metabolic syndrome. This doesn't totally cause obesity or diabetes by any means, but it can play a role. So the effect on the environment. BPA is going to end up in landfills or in the ocean. In landfills, it's going to go into the air, which, as I mentioned, it doesn't really affect us too much. But in the oceans, it's going to affect aquatic species and their habitats. So it's going to get into the water that fish are ingesting constantly, and it's, plastic in the water in general is a big problem, but having it in that habitat is causing its own problems. So it has similar effects that it does on humans, most notably to the reproductive system. In males, it was found that the testicular cells died, that sperm density and motility dropped, and that spermatogenesis was inhibited. So all three are required for male fish or male aquatic species to be able to reproduce. And then in females, it was also found that there was an absence of ovulation. So what's happening is both males and females are being affected, and that's making it harder to reproduce on both ends. Additionally, it was found that there are developmental, immune, and metabolic defects. So the long-term consequences, fish reproduction is going to be limited. If you can't reproduce on both ends, it's going to be harder to make more. So there's going to be fewer offspring. And then of the offspring that do survive, it's going to be harder for them because of the developmental defects and the immune defects and the metabolic defects. So concentrations vary in different areas of the ocean from 0.2 to 13,000 nanograms per gram. And it was obvious that the more there was, the more severe the effects of BPA. So in this image below, we see that there's a fish that was in a control solution and then a fish that was affected by high quantities of BPA. And you see that there's an obvious metabolic defect here. The fish is larger, the color's different, it doesn't appear as healthy. And that's notable because the fish not being healthy, they're not as likely to survive and they're going to die out. So the EPA is doing a lot to get BPA studied and understood. One of the biggest things is that we don't completely understand the hazards of BPA, and we need to know how we can reduce them and how we can avoid them. But also, there needs to be more. So by having BPA be considered a substance with unreasonable risk to injury, it would show up just like carcinogens. There would be a warning on the label that BPA can cause this and this and this effect. Also, there's a push to have more data developed on how it's affecting the environment, because when I tried to research this, there weren't really a ton of studies done beyond aquatic life. So we know that it binds to soil, but how is that affecting the soil? How is that affecting tree growth? How is that affecting land animals? And then finally, just pushing to get alternatives considered, such as I mentioned with receipts, there's thermal printing available, but it's not as cheap, and we should make it cheaper, and we should make it more of the standard. So the takeaway is that BPA is harmful to both humans and the environment. I'm sure this isn't a surprise to anyone, but it's kept in circulation, and that's frustrating because we know it's bad, but it's also the cheapest option for many where cost is everything. But really, we need to be pushing for the public to be more aware of the effects of BPA and how many of their products contain it and how they can reduce that. And while environmental activists are working to get it out of circulation, they can't do it alone. So us as students, we need to be pushing our peers, pushing our friends, pushing our family to limit their BPA use and to be more aware and actively research what products they're buying, because that's the best way to get it out of circulation, to not support industries that are actively using BPA because it's cheaper and because they don't want to support limiting it. So that's all I've got. These are my sources. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.